Hello, my primarily schizophrenic viewer base. Ayn Rand is probably the most influential lib-right thinker of the past 100 years, at least in the mainstream, right? In the 1980s, her disciples, adherents of her philosophy of objectivism, controlled basically every Western financial institution on Earth. They had the capacity to enact huge societal change and lead to a true capitalist golden age of innovation. This was partially realized, and the 80s and 90s were indeed a very prosperous time, but the potential of the moment was never really realized. And the reason it wasn't realized was because, while Ayn Rand was a brilliant thinker and got a huge number of things right, she also got a lot wrong. Today, I'd like to take a look at the philosophical thunderdome of Ayn Rand's objectivism and figure out what this chain-smoking, Russian capitalist Jewess got so remarkably right that it, really was prophetic, and where she got things, catastrophically wrong, because she did get some things pretty fucking wrong. Now, obviously, it goes without saying that Ayn Rand wasn't really just a novelist, she was more of a philosopher who looked at the world and essentially said, fuck you, I ought only care about myself. I should care about me and nobody else. Her philosophy, which, is objectivism for those who are uninformed, is built on 4 simple pillars. Number 1, reality exists independent of your feelings. Number 2, reason is your only tool to understand reality. Number 3, rational self-interest is the only moral code. And number 4, laissez-faire capitalism is the only system that doesn't suck commie dick. Pretty simple premise, right? It makes sense, I'm going to do something unusual for a change and actually start off by focusing on what she got right. We'll be nice. We'll be nice to start with, guys. It'll be nice to start with, okay? So objectivism's first big win is its metaphysical stance, right? That reality is objective and not the mushy soup of your truth and my truth and their truth and whatever. Rand basically said that the world exists whether you like it or not, and no amount of appealing to humanity or the greater good changes the laws of physics or economics. Printing money does not create wealth because the stated value of the money does not reflect reality. You will never be a woman because that would not reflect reality. It's essentially the somehow controversial opinion that reality is real. It very much derives from the thoughts of Aristotle and Descartes. And this makes sense when you look at economics, right? Rand knew that wealth isn't really a pie that you slice up, and it's instead created by individuals who generate value. If you produce value, you eat. If you don't, you starve. Simple shit. This ought to be a pretty reasonable position to pretty much anyone, and it's a great thing that she insisted upon the position, because clearly we haven't heard it enough in her absence if you look at the world today. The number of people who think that you should just be able to eat a meal for free, or that you have a right to food. You don't have a right to food, believe it or not. If you don't work, you should starve. If you don't provide value, you should starve. I'm ranting a little bit, guys, but it really irritates me. This isn't a common sense position for a lot of people. This is basic shit. Anyway, Rand's second W is her love for reason. Objectivism says that your brain is your only real tool for navigating reality, right? No divine revelations, no gut feelings, no appeals to authority or peer-reviewed studies, nothing like that. Objectivism is a rationalist philosophy, not an empiricist one. If you're wondering what the difference is that empiricists hold that knowledge comes from what we observe and experience through our senses, while rationalists believe that we can discover truth through reason alone, through things like mathematic proofs or deductive reasoning, right? Essentially, you don't need to see a peer-reviewed study to figure out that smoking weed and scrolling Reddit all day makes you a degenerate gooner. Now, this has always made sense to me. Reason ought to be our North Star. We really don't need a government to tell us that stealing is wrong. Reason shows us that property rights emerge from first principles. Murray Rothbard's book, The Ethics of Liberty, also tends to concur with Rand here. Use logic to deduce what's right. You ought not rely on government edicts. This is basic shit. Anyway, on to the next thing that she got correct, and where Rand really gets controversial, right? She says that selfishness isn't just okay, but it's actually moral. This position obviously made her hated among bleeding hearts and liberals. Objectivism's ethical core is rational self-interest, which means you ought to pursue your own happiness, not sacrifice yourself for others. It also means you shouldn't expect others to sacrifice for you. Me, personally, I love this. More of this, please. This shit is like cocaine to me. It seems to be a pretty obvious reality that people will only do things they want to do, ultimately. For example, you probably pay your taxes. If not, that's pretty based. Good for you. But most of you probably do. Now, does that mean that in an ideal world, you want to pay your taxes? No, of course not. Neither do I. Fuck the IRS. But it does mean that you prefer paying your taxes to having the police knock on your door. Or if you don't pay your taxes, then you would rather risk arrest than allow the government to steal from you. It is, by your judgment, the best of the choices available to you at the moment. It is what you want to do when given the other options, right? Now, this can be applied to anything. Why do you give to charity? It makes you feel good to give. Why don't you ram your car into climate protesters? Because the police would detain you. You will always pick, of the options that are available to you, the option that you prefer the most. This was most famously portrayed in Atlas Shrugged. John Galt, the character in the book who essentially got the business owners to go on strike and stop the motor of the world, said, quote, "I swear by my life and by my love of it that I will never live for the sake of another man." Now, this is treated as the great evil today, but really it shouldn't be. Like, why do you go to work? You probably go to work to get paid. You don't do it out of altruistic goodwill for your boss, and your boss doesn't pay you out of altruistic goodwill for you. He pays you because you do a job. I hope I'm making sense here. Anyway, probably her biggest W is Rand's love for the free market. She really saw it as the only system that respects reality, reason, and self-interest. In Capitalism, the Unknown Ideal, she argues that free markets let individuals trade value for value. No coercion needed, right? Capitalism, she says, is essentially just free people trading freely. Of course, I believe she doesn't take this premise far enough. Rand wanted limited government. I want no government, or at least no coercive one. Rand's vision of capitalism, where entrepreneurs like Howard Rourke or Dagny Taggart thrive without bureaucrats breathing down their necks, is like 90% of the way to Brass Gang and Capistan, okay? It's pretty good. She got pretty far, but she didn't go all the way. She should have gone all the way, she didn't go all the way. Anyway, I've praised Rand long enough, and you guys know I can't stand being nice in videos like this. It's killing me to do it for this long, frankly. Unfortunately, I do have to drag her through the mud for where she went wrong, and believe me, she does go wrong. Ultimately, Rand's biggest sin is their love affair with the state. Now, she wanted it quote-unquote minimal, but that's like saying you only want a little bit of cancer, and it's really where she dropped the ball. The thing is that she really insisted on having a government with a monopoly on force, which is just by far her biggest L. Objectivism says you need a state to protect individual rights, courts, police, military, all common concerns of minarchists, and generally the only argument you hear against ANCAPs, right? In The Virtue of Selfishness, Rand argues that without a government you get chaos, with private defense agencies turning into warlords faster than a tranny turns into a school shooter. Rand called anarcho-capitalism, quote, "the absurdity of competing governments," which is rich coming from someone who thought bureaucrats could be trusted not to fuck everything up. Additionally, I'm not sure why she thought free competition against people providing the services of arbitration or protection of rights would be a bad thing when she correctly identified market competition as a wonderful virtue in all other industries. Now, other libertarian thinkers have addressed the concerns of Rand. In For a New Liberty, Rothbard argues that markets can provide law, order, and defense better than any government. Why? Because competition, as a rule, beats monopoly. Imagine if you could choose your police like you choose your internet provider. If Comcast sucks, you could switch to WoW, or Starlink, or Frontier, or any other number of providers. But with government monopolized, as it is now, you're instead stuck with a system where every bureaucratic agency is ran like the DMV, in that it's slow, corrupt, and staffed by people who fucking hate you. Seriously, dude, my contempt for the DMV is immeasurable. My contempt for the state is infinite, alright? By the way, it's not like privatization of security is like an untested thesis either, by the way. Not that that should have stopped Rand either, since, if what she says in her books are anything to go by, she ought to resent appeals to precedent. But the thing is that private security is already implemented in literally every single valuable installation across the world. My main guy, Mr. Ration Pie, is a private security guard. People hire private security for a reason, and unlike police, they're accountable to customers, not to voters or some DA or corporate chief of justice, right? Rather, to attain Rand's sphere of competing governments, you have to ignore that markets ultimately self-correct. If a private government starts acting like a cartel, competitors will undercut them, and the consumers will leave. Instead, what we get from government monopolies is stuff like Ruby Ridge, Waco, or the school shooting in Uvalde, Texas. All cases where the government monopoly fails to do what they ought to do and people die because of it. Now, to steelman her position, Rand's defenders argue that private agencies could become coercive, charging protection money like a mafia. They argue that a government monopoly ensures quote-unquote objective law. But the reality is, of course, that the government is a mafia, the only difference being that it's legalized its own protection racket. Look at the IRS. Either you pay up, or you go to jail. There is no third option. How is that not coercion? At least with private governments, you can negotiate or walk away. But Rand's objective law is ultimately enforced by the same people who gave us the Patriot Act, and you really don't want to give these people an inch, or they'll take a mile, trust me. Unfortunately, it doesn't end there though, and Rand also goes wrong in her version of the non-aggression principle, or NAP. Rand instead promoted a non-initiation of force principle, which frankly comes closer to a copyright violation than I would have expected from someone who supported IP law as strongly as she did. Anyway, it's pretty close to the non-aggression principle, but she fumbles it. The NIFP says nobody should initiate force against others. Cool, we agree. But Rand thinks you need a government to enforce it, which is essentially like hiring a rapist to guard a nunnery, or a pedophile to guard a school, or a transgender to guard a kindergarten. You really don't need a state to say, don't hit first. You can enforce that without Washington. Now, and again, to steelman her position, objectivists argue that without a final arbiter, aka the government, disputes between private defense agencies could escalate into violence. Ooh. They point to scenarios like copyright disputes, where PDAs might have different rules, leading to conflict. The thing is that in the real world, markets would solve this through standardization, like how Visa and MasterCard agree on transaction protocols by themselves without the need for top-down regulatory control of credit cards. Additionally, if violence were to emerge from market disagreements, and there's no reason to think they would, but again, I'm steelmanning her position here, at least it wouldn't be anything like Vietnam or Iraq. You still have the final assurance that private conflicts are smaller and don't involve mandatory conscription or carpet bombing. This ultimately is the Objectivism Paradox. Rand hated coercion, but loved a coercive institution, the state. She wanted a government funded by voluntary taxation, which frankly is an oxymoron, to protect people's rights. Protect them from what? Other people, of course. The thieves and parasites, who just so happen to be the same sort of people who would be attracted to taking government positions. Now, I've done my research for this video, and while looking for counter-arguments to my point, I found this article, Government Financing in a Free Society, from the Atlas Society, an objectivist think tank. Basically, they suggest that lotteries or various different fees could fund the state, but I still think that's a fantasy. Governments don't really play nice, they grow like a tumor. Look at the US, for example. We started with a 1% tax, and now your tax rate sits somewhere around the 50% mark, and your money is used to fund food stamps for parasites and war in the Middle East, which is, really awesome. I'm sure the founding fathers would have loved that. I'm sure that's what they envisioned, guys. Really great shit. Rand's minimal government would still need to initiate force to exist, which contradicts her NIFP. She insists on rejecting private solutions like insurance-based defense or decentralized arbitration, which have been proven efficable by real-world examples like private mediation resolving business disputes. Rand's blind spot is thinking that only the state can be trusted when history shows states are genuinely the biggest rights violators. The Holodomor, the Holocaust, the 100 Years' War, the state is only trustworthy insofar as you can trust it to violate your rights. So, ultimately, Rand was based in red pill for championing reason, selfishness, and capitalism, but she became a blue-pilled libtard when it came to the state, to put it in terms that all y'all can understand. Basically, she failed to take her ideas to their logical conclusion. If coercion is bad, all coercion is bad, including the government kind. Rand loved markets, but thought they couldn't handle laws and order, even though markets already solve complex problems anyway. Uber solved public transportation, the internet solved communication, crypto solved the monopolization of banking. These were all considered public services even 40 years ago, regulated by the Federal Communication Commission, or the Department of Transportation, or the Federal Trade Commission. But today they've been privatized, and they work a lot better now that they have been. Why wouldn't law be able to be privatized exactly? Private arbitration firms solve disputes faster than courts do already, and private security outperforms cops in rich neighborhoods. Detroit's Threat Management Center provides better protection than the city's corrupt police do, and they don't need to tax you to do it. They rely purely on voluntary exchange. I think that Rand thought the state could be tamed, but the truth is that governments always grow and always oppress. The US went from life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness to spying on your emails and indoctrinating your children on the values of polyamory in public school. Ultimately, minimal government is a half measure, and you cannot afford compromises, alright? You own your body, your property, and your life, not only partially. You don't own most of your body, you own it all. You cannot have a minimalist state owning only a minimal part of your body. You're either owned totally or not at all. There really is no middle ground here. I don't want you guys to get the wrong idea. Ayn Rand was a titan and clairvoyant, and I really do have a lot of respect for her. I've been rereading Atlas Shrugged to write this script, and with what's happening in New York and Europe, it really strikes me how accurately she predicted what has happened. I really do recommend that any of you who haven't read it go out and read it. What's funny too is that if you read the quotes of her critics, if you listen to them, they would all fit perfectly in the book, and their criticisms only prove her points about them more correct. She was right about reality, reason, selfishness, and capitalism, and so right that it's made communists seethe over it for about 50 years now. But unfortunately, she didn't go all the way. She was wrong about the state, clinging to a monopoly on force like a boomer conservacuck clings to Israeli war bonds. Her ideas were good, but she failed to take them to their logical conclusion. The Objectivism Paradox is this. Rand championed individual liberty, but couldn't let go of the state's leash. She wanted to preserve coercion to protect against coercion. And also, just as an aside, she supported IP law and whatnot, which I probably should talk about, but this video is decently long already, and Liquid Zulu already put out a good video about it on his channel, so go check that out. Speaking of Liquid Zulu, it's worth noting that the majority of the critiques I make in this video are mostly applicable to Randian objectivists, and not really anarcho-objectivists like Zulu. Anyway, thank you all for watching, you real American patriots. I'm glad you all trusted the plan. Keep trusting the plan. My plan, to clarify, not anyone else's. We're starting Brastanon. It'll be phenomenal. Anyway, smash that like button, subscribe, and go harass people on X or Twitter in my name. That would be based. Anyway, peace out, gang. Bye-bye.